I have in the past done my utmost best to offer sage watch collecting advice to you all, but then I'm hardly the only mouth you'll ever hear from. So I wanted to make sure you're armed not just with an understanding of the right way to go about things, but also forewarned about all things wrong as well. So here it is, the worst advice I've ever heard in all my years wearing watches, so you don't stumble and end up dead. Or with a bad watch, whichever's worse. By the way, the last one's really going to be in this video. The first worst piece of advice is actually probably the worst overall, because it's this that's got you into this mess in the first place. I'd like to hope there's still time for you, but given that you're here taking mental notes on what not to do, it's already too late. So here it is. The worst piece of advice about collecting watches is the very notion of collecting watches. I'd say don't do it. Stay away. Save your bank account from getting pillaged British Empire style. Watches are expensive, and pointlessly so. Even the cheap ones are expensive. In fact, if you start collecting watches, your idea of what's cheap will change completely. You'll start to say ludicrous things like, only £5,000, and develop an unhealthy obsession with other men's wrists. The siren song may sound sweet, but unfortunately these sirens have credit card readers. It's fool's gold, if fool's gold were actually foil-wrapped nuggets of shit. You could see the world, ride a motorcycle, take up a crocodile habit. Trust me, the idea of an addiction to a flesh-eating drug will sound like bliss compared to lusting after a house-price wristwatch. So assuming that it's too late for you, let's move on quickly. Those teeth have long sunk into your flesh, and now the only way out is forward. Well, it's not. There's no way out. Forward just seems less painful. It's not, but whatever. So there's always this one watch versus many watches conversation, and I've heard plenty of times someone saying some combination of, you should just put all your money into one watch to get the most out of it, or you should buy multiple cheap watches so you've got options. Both of those are reasonable approaches to maintaining your own collection, but as for advice to someone else, may as well tell them which side to dress on and how their fart should smell. It's entirely subjective whether someone prefers to have one, a few, or many of a thing, and to suggest some kind of authority over another person's preference is tantamount to running for office. It's true, some watches offer better value for money than others. There are brands out there, naming no names, but let's just say they more or less rhyme with Pilchard Grill, that have such a poor ratio of cost to quality that I'm surprised they don't have a government contract. But it doesn't matter. Not in the slightest. Because do you know what the best value for money is? The excellent job your phone is already doing of keeping the time. Your phone can tell you the time to the nearest millisecond. It can tell you the time in Kuala Lumpur. It can tell you the time on goddamn Mars if you so wish. So as a piece of advice, telling someone not to buy a watch because it offers poorer value than something else defeats the entire purpose of buying one in the first place, for showing off to other people. Yes, I could buy a Seiko instead and receive many value for money. Or I could buy that filching Jill and get that sweet Instagram love I've been dreaming of. Point is, people choose watches because of how they make them feel, and for some, squeezing every last drop of value out of their watch may make them fizz real good, or simply buying the one they like the look of, whether the cost to quality is great or not, is what's really going to smoke their bacon. Ever been browsing around used watches and found a few fancy-looking fellows that come well under the price you expected? Imagine the money you'd save buying one of those instead of something more down-to-earth. But there's a problem with this recommendation, because there's a bigger shock in store buying bargain top-name watch brands than you'll get calling Bill Cosby's date night advice line. Expensive watches end up cheap because they're not in vogue, but I'll tell you what's very much on trend: charging an ungodly amount for a service. After all, someone's got to pay for those fancy biscuits they put out at the boutique. Watches get expensive when they're expensive to make, and that price doesn't go down just because the watch has already been made. And unless you want to take your chances with a set of Amazon screwdrivers and a YouTube crash course on watchmaking, you're not going to wiggle out of it. You could try and save money by using a local watchmaker, but if they haven't already run for the hills when you tell them what you've got, you're still going to have the problem of paying for parts, if they can even get them. There's two ways out of paying for a big bill, servicing what was once an expensive watch, and one of them I don't think your parents would be particularly proud of. So you like to swim a bit. You enjoy the feeling of cool sea sewage on your nethers. Perhaps once in a while you'll even strap on a snorkel and spot some shopping trolleys. Great, you'll need a watch with at least 300 meters of water resistance. Not. To be fair, the water resistance game is a bit of an odd one. 30 meters means the watch is basically a silica gel sachet. 50 meters means it's fine to hold a glass of water with, and 100 meters means it won't immediately oxidize into dust if it gets submerged. But 300 meters is kind of nuts. That's for actual divers who dive and do that O thing with their thumb and forefinger. You are very welcome to own a watch water resistant to 300 meters, but to swim with, you definitely don't need it. Unless your local swimming pool is at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, you'll be fine swimming with 100, maybe even 50. No one's really sure about 50. The stupid thing is that 50 meters is a pretty long way down. That's like 15 floors. You certainly wouldn't want to jump it. So I've never really understood why a watch rated to 50 meters deep is questionable at 50 centimeters deep. I don't know. I don't want you moaning that I broke your watch, so I'll leave my confidence firmly placed on 300 meters being overkill for a swim. Buying watches is a lot like looking for purpose in life. There is no purpose in life. We're all just clumps of dust fused together for a bit and then we die. So by extension, there is no purpose to your collection. You can have one watch, 10 watches, they can all be different, or if you really want, they can all be exactly the same. What you don't need to do, if you don't want to, is diversify your collection. This isn't Wall Street, it's Dingleberry Drive, where we collect watches to distract ourselves from the inevitable moment when we cease to be these specific clumps of dust fused together. To suggest a collection must contain a specific ratio of watch types is, to be frank, arse jam. I'll refer you to a previous piece of actually good advice, which is to buy watches however you want to, and to tell anyone who suggests otherwise to find out if 50 meters is a long way down. Your collection will be made up of whichever watches you choose to put in it, and sometimes some of those watches will turn out to be ones you didn't really want after all. I call those particular watches mine. The ones we all really want are always someone else's anyway. This piece of bad advice extends well beyond watches and is a phrase I've often heard associated with people who think COVID improves Wi-Fi range and that politicians harness their energy from the sun. It goes like this: insurance is a scam. Can you get ripped off with overly expensive or poor quality insurance? Is it a bad idea to invite Mike Tyson round for drinks and nibbles? Of course, but even so-so insurance can be better than no insurance at all if it still pays out something. Speaking of Mike Tyson, he once said, "Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face." And although he wasn't talking about insurance plans, he probably should have been. If you have your watch taken, you lose it, or whatever, there are very few scenarios where you wouldn't quite like to have that money back. Thank you very much. Now, it may well be that you choose to measure up the risk and go without, but that still doesn't mean insurance is a scam. I've heard, and this is not a joke, someone say something like, "I've been paying insurance for years and I've never had a penny out of it. It's just a scam." And I have to wonder in what faraway land someone would live in to begrudge not having a miserable situation before them. Insurance is a scam, myth busted. I thought we'd all grown out of this when our balls dropped, but apparently no. There are still some people out there suggesting that certain watches will, and I hate this phrase, get you girls. First off, getting girls as an expression sounds more like contracting a disease or some kind of infestation. And secondly, it's not like girls and getting them is simply a byproduct of only one particular object. I don't see why your interest in collecting watches couldn't interest a prospective partner. Actually, what the hell am I talking about? But I fail to see a scenario that goes something like, "Get away from me, you smell like old biscuits. Wait, is that a Breitling?" Ever happening. And to be honest, if it did, it would be a concern. Maybe those two actually make the perfect couple. There's many different ways to look at the behaviour of collecting things. For some, it's the act of owning an array of objects that take their fancy. For others, it's a completionist escapade that ends when there's nothing left to collect. And for others still, it's how they relive the moment they saw the light fade from their victim's eyes. It's an experience unique to its instigator, a narrative led by one thing and one thing alone: personal preference. To suggest someone's watchbox must contain a set regime is completely ridiculous. It's not the Noah's Ark of watch collecting. We're not trying to immortalise the entire watch industry in a 10-slot box. Watch Neo won't walk in and say, "Dive watches. I need dive watches. And a chronograph." Live and let live. This one isn't so often dished out as point-blank advice actually, but I'm not really sure what else you're supposed to do with it. The topic of violent watch crimes in our city's streets is a hot one, and the idea of having your day, and in many ways your life, completely torn out from underneath you over a wristwatch is a pretty harrowing thought. But there's always that one guy who says, "I wouldn't let them take my watch," which could only ever be interpreted as, "You would let someone take your watch? Are you even a man? Or are you several small chihuahuas balanced on top of one another dressed in men's clothes? I bet you're still breastfed." Just don't. If there's a threat of any kind of harm, just hand it over. If you've got self-defense skills, they'll have a knife. If you've got a knife, they'll have a gun. And if you've got a gun, they'll have an army of chihuahuas balanced on top of one another dressed in men's clothes. Chances are they're more experienced at this than you are, and they won't abide by Queensberry rules either. At best, they'll take your watch. Don't make it end up worse. At least the insurance pays out. Whilst I generally subscribe to the idea of not bailing out on working towards a goal, the inverse suggestion that a cheaper watch won't make you happy shouldn't be the default opinion. It is entirely possible to realign your goals by buying a cheaper watch than was originally intended and still come out tops. There are certainly some scenarios where this is harder. If you really want a Submariner and go for a Seamaster instead, you'll likely get the same satisfaction of a conversation you had something to add to long after it's moved on. If you're in the market for an annual calendar Patek, however, and deviate into a Breguet for a lot less money instead, you might find yourself satiated by the incredible legacy of the Breguet, as well as the impressive watchmaking. How can you know if the outcome will be favourable? That's the tricky bit. You don't know until you try. Sometimes it just clicks and the mind flea disappears. Other times it burrows in there deeper than an Oscar Wilde quote and invites all its friends over for the kind of house party that makes the news. It's a crapshoot, but when it pays off, it can pay off big. Just because I would prefer to have a mechanical watch doesn't mean I don't like quartz. Quartz watches can not only be very well made, there are plenty of examples from Patek Philippe, F. Bichon and Jaeger-LeCoultre that could get even the most die-hard quartz hater frothing at the wallet, they can also offer much more opportunity at the budget end to get a watch otherwise out of reach. If you're looking for a dressy two-hander from a classic name, quartz has got your back. If you want to explore the wacky world of the hybrid spring drive, you couldn't do it without quartz. Quartz is just another way of solving the same problem, and dismissing it just because it's not entirely mechanical is like turning down a ride in a Bugatti because it's not a horse. I'm not going to say every watch collection has to have a quartz, but I certainly think a blanket dismissal is a bad look. Call me reckless, call me a fiscal terrorist if you must, but I don't see what all the big hoo-ha is about financing a watch. Whenever it comes up in conversation, I'll be more specific, whenever it comes up in conversation online, the entire topic gets treated like raw sewage. Here's what I do agree with. Taking out a loan for a luxury item isn't ideal. Is it worse than pushing an old lady down the stairs and then taking the elevator down real quick so you can fart on her when she reaches the bottom? No, but the internet seems to think it is. I wouldn't recommend an interest-bearing loan for a watch if you're strapped for cash. But if it's the one thing you've got going on in your life that brings a smile to your face, I'm hardly going to give you grief for it either. A lot of watch finance comes at 0% interest too, which, when properly managed, can make even more sense than buying in cash. At any rate, blanket badging finance as the official 8th deadly sin is a bit OTT. What makes something real or not? Is it the ownership of a corporeal presence? Or is it what some guy on the internet decides because he thinks the Apple Watch isn't a real watch? Well, I can categorically state that the Apple Watch is indeed a small timepiece typically worn on a strap on one's wrist, as is the Oxford English Dictionary definition. Clues in the name, really. It's not called the Apple Not a Real Watch, after all. Why does the Apple Watch get lambasted with such criticism? Maybe it's because it's hard to reconcile the feelings of someone enjoying a version of the thing you paid 100 times more for. I don't think this is about the Apple Watch at all. I think this is about a creeping habit of people downplaying other people's enjoyment. Not sure what happened to being happy for other people, but today it seems like there's a finite amount of joy in the world, and the only way to get it is to take someone else's. The origin of an object can tell you a lot about its quality. Old French grape juice, for example. People love it. It's got a reputation for being the best, and most expensive, and isn't always the best. Sometimes simply being old French grape juice is enough to get away with a big price tag without actually being worth it, when there's better and cheaper stuff available elsewhere. Swiss watches very much fall into the same category. It's an easy way to tell you're getting quality, even if that's not necessarily true. Not all good watches are made in Switzerland, and not all watches made in Switzerland are good. So the sage advice to only buy Swiss-made just isn't doing you any favours at all. It may be that the allure of the Alpenhorn is enough to hold your cheese, but don't be afraid to leave the landlocked nation if you're looking for high-quality watchmaking. One I'm really hoping to see fade away as secondary prices start to settle down is the notion that you'll do better at the authorised dealer if you invest in their lifestyle. I don't mean like getting on and being friendly, that's just being a decent human. I'm talking about set strategies for wooing your dealer into getting you hard-to-buy pieces, aka bribery. First, it's getting them gifts, then it's taking them out to dinner. Before you know it, you're sat in the back row of the movie theatre discussing if it's time to meet the parents. You didn't swipe right for Rolex, so you shouldn't be dating your dealer. If anyone's got some schmoozing to do, it should really be the other way around. That's not to say it doesn't work. You just might get that Submariner if you do yourself up real nice and squeal like a piggy. Alternatively, you could just save yourself the hassle and get one pre-owned. They're about the same price these days anyway. There are some watches I think are too big for me, and some that I think are too small. Perhaps by some coincidence you have the same size wrist as me. That's 7 inches for all the Hamzas out there who didn't believe me, and you want to wear a watch I wouldn't. Well, good for you, and I hope you enjoy it. Just because I'm not comfortable wearing that size doesn't mean I should enforce that feeling on you. I'm not the size Gestapo, and neither should anyone else be. If you ask me my opinion, sure, I would share it with you, and it may well be that you've got the sassy pants to pull it off. An unsolicited take, however, is something I'd keep to myself. After all, if I think your watch is too big or too small for you, so what? There are a couple of exceptions where I would intervene. If you were going to a job interview and your watch was wearing you, I might step in. Unless it was to sell used cars, of course, in which case go right ahead. Or if you were attending the Ancient Order of the Farting Fruit Bat Southeastern Chapter annual orgy, I might suggest a small dress piece wasn't best suited. One of the many factors with which to make a decision when buying a watch is resale. Unless the plan is to never sell anything ever, even the wellest of heel will take into consideration the possibility of bathing on a watch sale. Even if there's no intention to sell, life is but a mortal merry-go-round, a game of transient tiddlywinks if you will, and sometimes the winks fall just outside the proverbial pot. So considering the value of a watch as part of its appeal is just good practice really. In relation to what you can afford, the more expensive that outlay becomes, the more you'd like to have back again should needs must. But that's different to the expectation of getting more than what is put in, the expectation of investment. A watch can be many things, a trinket, an heirloom, a mortician's end-of-year bonus, but it should never be considered an investment. It is possible to spend money on a watch and make more back, but the expectation of this happening is a surefire way to end up poorer. In the last 3 years, the watch market index has increased by a barely noticeable 0.5%, but for those who jumped in 2 years ago, they've been hit harder than a San Fran convenience store. If investment's the aim of the game, stick to the Dow Jones. Buying new can be frustrating for a couple of reasons, either because of tragic levels of depreciation or simple unavailability. Finding that sweet spot gets a whole lot easier when shopping second-hand, even if some would advise against it. Do you need your wits about you? Unless you want to get screwed worse than a rounded Phillips head, yes. You need to be careful to find a reputable outlet, good quality product, and a price that's right. But if you do, opportunities abound. In fact, many authorised dealers these days now operate their own selection of used watches, and even if they are a bit more expensive, there's still savings to be had from new. So the advice to steer clear of pre-owned because of the risks in purchasing don't apply anymore anyway. But just about the worst piece of advice I've ever come across is this: just buy one good watch for life. That's like the crack dealer suggesting you take just one puff and call it a day. There is no one watch. Our religion is a polytheistic one, our gods relentless and vengeful. Try as you might, the idea of simply owning one is as straightforward as gluing butter. It cannot be done. If you are able to buy one watch and be done with it, you will have achieved enlightenment and will disappear in a puff of Mobius 9010. And if you're not sure how to store all the watches entering your collection, there's no need to worry, because it's a self-solving problem. You'll lose half in the divorce anyway. See you next time.